So we're now going to go and talk about bones and skeletal tissues in quite a bit more depth now. So our new unit is the bones and the skeleton. And so today what we're going to talk about are bones and the skeletal tissue. We'll talk about the different components of the skeleton and kind of how we classify different parts of the skeleton and discuss kind of the microscopic, gross anatomy of the bones. Okay, so one thing to just remember about bones and skeletal tissues is that they are living and dynamic organs. So bone tissues are living, dynamic, organs, okay? And they will be kind of formed, bone tissue will be formed and remodeled throughout life, not just when you break a bone or anything like that, but there's constant kind of formation and remodeling that's going on at all times. Before we get into kind of the major skeleton, we are going to just re-mention the cartilages because the skeletal cartilages are going to be important. So skeletal cartilages. Okay, and the human skeleton is initially composed of just cartilage and fibrous tissue. Okay, so this is when we're an embryo. It will later be replaced by bone, but it's going to be initially composed of cartilage and fibrous tissue. Okay, and this is then later replaced by bone in most of the places. There are some places that cartilage are going to be maintained throughout life, and those are going to be kind of important in areas that need to have flexibility. Okay, so certain areas, we'll say, so cartilage is maintained in adulthood. In regions where flexible skeletal tissue is needed. Okay, and so we'll talk about some of those locations. So again, this is going to mainly be a review of stuff that we've talked about for cartilage, but we're just going to go over it again so you can have kind of a refresher on it. Okay, so we're going to talk about the basic kind of structure, types, and locations of the cartilage. Okay, so skeletal cartilage is going to be made up of a variety of the cartilage tissue. So we talked about the 3 different types, and we'll mention those again. And basically those 3 types are going to kind of be incorporated in areas that need different types of functions, okay? So just a reminder, cartilage is going to be mostly water. So that is one of its main components. And this just allows it to be very resilient. So it also has other tissue, but it's very resilient. Okay, and so it has this capacity to spring back to its original shape after being compressed. So that's going to be one of the main functions of it. So it's going to be able to kind of take an impact and then come back to its normal shape and not be, really deformed after. Remember that it does not have blood vessels or any nerves. Okay, so it's going to be mainly this avascular and no nerves tissue. And so it's going to mainly get its nutrients from a surrounding structure, which is called the perichondrium, which we'll talk about now. Okay, so we have this perichondrium. Sorry, that is one word. Just kind of made a gap on there. And this is going to be a layer of dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay, and this is going to surround the cartilage. So it kind of holds it all together. Okay, it is sometimes called a girdle, so it kind of is this structure that will be around the cartilage that will then help resist outward expansion. Okay, so it resists, oops, did not spell that right. Resists outward expansion. So it allows for the cartilage to deform and change shape, but it can only change shape so much. So it's going to kind of be this surrounding layer that's going to help kind of protect it from moving too much. Okay. This perichondrium is what has the blood vessels. So this contains blood vessels and nerves. Okay, and so this is going to allow for nutrients to be delivered. So nutrient delivery to cartilage. Okay, and because the perichondrium is on the outside of the cartilage thickness can't get too big, because otherwise the actual nutrients can't diffuse. Okay, so the thickness of cartilage is limited by the distance nutrients can diffuse. So you cannot find super thick patches of cartilage because the nutrients will not be able to diffuse far enough, okay? So it can only become so thick. All right, all three types of the different cartilages are gonna have some basic characteristics. So, okay, we're gonna have three types of cartilage. Okay, so same basic components, kind of just how the amount and the arrangement is what's going to make them different. So same basic components. Okay, so we have the cells called chondrocytes. Okay, which are found in lacunae. All right, they're going to have an extracellular matrix, ECM, containing a jelly-like ground substance. And fibers. Okay. So we'll now talk kind of about the three different types in a little more detail and talk about where they're located on the actual skeleton. And so this is going to be kind of more, we've talked about some of these previously, but now we're actually going to be talking about like, okay, we're going to learn the bones. So we'll talk about the sternum, ribs, and then we'll start talking about costal cartilage, which is going to be a type of cartilage that's going to kind of articulate with both of those areas. So kind of get into a little more depth of how these different cartilages are going to actually function in the overall skeleton. Okay, so we have hyaline. Okay, so this is the most abundant type. Okay, it is going to provide support with flexibility. Okay, and it is going to be resilient or have resilience. Okay, it's going to contain only collagen fibers. And these collagen fibers are basically invisible when you look at them on a slide. Okay, and the chondrocytes are kind of spherical, so they look like circles. Okay, so more or less going to be circular. Okay, so let's talk about where in the skeleton the hyaline cartilage is going to be found. So you're going to find hyaline cartilages at all of the articulation points of most of the joints. Okay, and so we're going to call this articular. Articular cartilage. And just, again, I like to know what the words mean because that kind of tells you something about it. So this artic is going to mean joint. Okay, or point of connection. So articulation. Okay, and so it's going to cover the ends of most long bones. And we'll talk about what long bones are today. Okay, at movable joints. At movable joints. Okay, so that's going to be the first place that we find hyaline cartilage. The next place is going to be the costal cartilage, or costal. Okay, and so these are going to be connections. So they connect the ribs to the sternum, which is the breastbone. Okay. And then we're going to find hyaline cartilage also in the respiratory cartilages. Okay, and so they're going to form the skeleton of the larynx, which is the voice box. And reinforce other respiratory passageways. So keep these open. All right. We also are going to find it in the nasal cartilage. Which is going to be support of the external nose. All right, so when we start, and I have all these pictures on canvas. So hyaline cartilage is going to be the kind of blue. So it's going to be found in the trachea. So the trachea, you can actually feel it if you touch your throat. You're going to see it in the costal cartilages. You're also going to see it at kind of all of these major points where you have long bones connected. It is not going to be located in the knees. We're going to have a different type of cartilage that's going to be found there. But in most of the other locations where you have long bones connected. So like in the hands, in the feet, and places like that. Okay. All right. Our next type of cartilage is going to be elastic cartilage. And elastic cartilage is basically the same as hyaline, except it has elastic fibers. Okay, so very similar to hyaline. but with elastic fibers. Okay, and so this is going to give some stretch. So stretchy, elastic fibers are better able to withstand repeated bending. Okay, this is only found in 2 locations. It is going to be found in the external ear, and it's going to be found in the epiglottis. And kind of all of them start with E, so that kind of gives you an idea. So elastic cartilage, external ear, epiglottis. So the epiglottis is going to be this little green structure right here. It's kind of hard to see on this picture, but it's going to be this flap of tissue that is going to help close the respiratory tract when you're swallowing food. And it's also going to be found in the external ear. Okay, so your ear is very flexible and bendy. It's going to allow for that bend. All right. The last type of cartilage is going to be fibrocartilage. Okay, this cartilage is going to be highly compressible. With great tensile strength. Okay, it's going to have parallel rows of chondrocytes alternating with thick collagen fibers. Okay, so this type of cartilage is going to be found in places that are subjected to very high pressure and stretch. Okay, so high pressure and stretch. They're going to be load-bearing areas, and so you're going to find these in the pad-like cartilages of the menisci, which are the meniscus of the knee, and of the disc between the cartilages. Sorry, disc between the vertebra. Okay, and so on here, again, make sure you pull up this picture, but you can find it at the knees. You are also going to find it at the pubic symphysis, which is kind of this area between the 2 os coxa, and then in between the actual vertebrae. Okay, so these are all areas that are going to have to deal with substantial amounts of stress. You know, the knees are going to hold the weight, and your backbone is also going to have to bear a lot of weight. And so these are going to need to be able to be compressible and have a lot of great strength. Okay, so a little bit about the growth of cartilage. We have not really talked about growth of cartilage before. And so this is where we're getting a little more in depth into these tissues that we haven't really talked about before. So cartilage is going to have this, has a very flexible matrix. And because of that, it allows for mitosis. Okay, because if you imagine, if it's really solid structure, mitosis isn't as easy to have happen because it's like cells are stuck. Okay, there are 2 ways that cartilage grows. And we will talk about the growth of skeletal or bone which is also going to have to do with cartilage as well. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit later in a next lecture. But we'll talk about the two ways that cartilage is going to grow. The first type is called appositional growth. Okay, and so in this case, what happens is you have cartilage forming cells in the surrounding perichondrium. And they secrete new matrix against the external face of the existing cartilage. Okay, so this is going to be kind of on the edges of the actual perichondrium. So you kind of have the perichondrium, and then you can have kind of the cartilage matrix in here, and then you're going to have kind of some cells on the edges that are going to start making new matrix and kind of pushing in towards that area. Okay. The second type is going to be called interstitial growth. Okay, and so these are you're gonna have lacunae bound chondrocytes that are going to divide and secrete new matrix. Okay, and they're going to expand the cartilage from within. Okay, so typically cartilage growth is going to end during adolescence when the skeleton is going to stop. And so kind of when we start talking about growth in bones, we will talk about cartilage again, but the kind of typically, so cartilage growth ends in adolescence. Okay, and that's basically when the skeleton also stops growing. Okay, and we mentioned this briefly before, but there can be calcification of the cartilage, which can happen during normal growth in youth and also kind of in old age. The hardened cartilage, when it's calcified, is not the same as bone. And so it's going to have kind of a different type of structure. Now, one thing that's going to be important in this unit is to be able to kind of compare and contrast cartilage and bone. And so I'm going to kind of write this out. We haven't talked much about the bone yet today, but we're going to have this list of how these are different from each other. So we'll have cartilage on this side, bone over here. Okay, and so cartilage is going to be surrounded by perichondrium. Okay, and bone is going to be surrounded by periosteum. I really like to use compare and contrast lists as kind of short answer questions on lab exams and lecture exams. So kind of this is something that I would probably put a star by in my notes. Okay, there are no blood vessels in cartilage or nerves. There are going to be blood vessels and nerves throughout bone, okay? Chondrocytes are going to be located in lacunae, and we're going to have osteocytes in lacunae in bone. So kind of a similar terminology. Cartilage is going to have a flexible extracellular matrix, and the bone is going to have a rigid extracellular matrix, okay? And this is going to be mainly due to inorganic salts, which we'll talk about a little bit later. All right, the ECM, our extracellular matrix, is made by chondroblasts. And the ECM, at least the organic part, which we call this is prior to when we have the actual inorganic salts. The osteoid is going to be the organic part, is going to be made by osteoblasts. Okay. For cartilage, they're going to have both appositional and interstitial growth. And when we talk about bone growth, it's going to only be appositional. Okay, so you do not see interstitial growth in bone. All right, so we are now going to start talking about the actual skeleton and bones, okay? So before we start talking about the skeleton, I just want to go over kind of the main functions of bones. Okay, and so they have several important functions, and these different functions are going to kind of vary from support to hormone production. So we're going to go through these. Okay, so support is the first one we're going to talk about. Okay, so bones are going to provide a framework that supports the body and cradles soft organs. Okay, we're also going to have protection. Okay, so for example, the bones of the skull protect the brain, vertebra protect spinal cord, the ribs protect the vital organs of the thorax. Okay, so like the heart, the lungs, those things are going to be protected by the ribs. Bones also allow for anchorage. Okay, and so skeletal muscles are going to attach to bones. Okay, and they usually do this through tendons. Okay, they use bones as levers to move the body. Okay, and its parts. Okay, we won't really go into much of the levers. We'll talk about movements of the arms and the different types of muscle actions. But basically, the bone is going to provide kind of this solid support that then muscles can attach to and then basically allow them to move. Okay? Bones also act as a site of mineral storage. Okay? So they are going to be a reservoir. Oops, forgot an L, V. Reservoir for minerals, calcium, and phosphorus or phosphate. Okay, and basically, sorry, that is AO. The bones, when necessary, will release kind of the minerals into the bloodstream, and then they can be distributed through the blood. Okay, bones are also going to be important in blood cell formation. Okay, so most blood cells are going to be formed here. Okay, and we call this process hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis, which is going to kind of it's going to occur in the red marrow, which is going to be found in some of the bones. Okay. It also is going to be a site for triglyceride storage. Okay, and so triglycerides are fats. Okay, and is stored in the yellow marrow, which is also found in many of the long bones that we'll talk about a little bit later. So many of the long bones that are going to be found in the body will store yellow marrow in them. Not very many bones actually store a lot of red marrow, at least in adulthood. We will talk about the ones that are going to be very active in blood actual production, blood cell production. Okay, the last major function is going to be hormone production. Just left out an R. Okay, and so bones produce something called osteoclastin. Oops, I spelled that wrong. So that's OSTEOCALCIN. So this is a C, sorry. Let me just put it under osteocalcin. Okay, and this is a hormone that is going to help regulate insulin secretion, glucose homeostasis, and energy expenditure. Okay, so those are going to be the major kind of functions of the skeleton. All right, so now we're going to get into kind of more of a classification of bones. Okay, so there are 206 bones named in the body that kind of make up the skeleton. They are divided into two groups. We are going to have the axial skeleton. Okay, and the axial skeleton is going to, let me find my picture, basically be kind of this central, this orange part right here where it has a skull. It's going to have the cervical vertebra. It's going to have the ribs and the sternum, and then it's also going to have the rest of the vertebra that go down, the kind of thoracic vertebra and the lumbar vertebra, and also we're going to have the sacrum and the coccyx down here. Okay, so these are going to be the actual axial skeleton bones. Okay, so they're going to be kind of the long axis of body. Okay, so skull, vertebral column, and rib cage. Okay, These are going to be important for protection, support, okay, and allows for kind of carrying of other body parts. So for example, carrying the kind of the major weight of the upper body and things like that. Okay, the second group is going to be the appendicular skeleton. Okay, when you think of appendicular, think of appendages. So these are going to be the arms and the legs. So bones of upper and lower limbs. Okay, they are also going to be what we call the girdles attaching the limbs to the skeleton. Okay, so we have girdles attaching limbs to skeleton. Those two girdles are going to be the pectoral girdle and the pelvic girdle. Okay, and so your pectoral girdle are going to be kind of, what makes up the shoulder. We have the clavicles, we're going to have the scapula, we're going to have that area right there. And then for this part, this is going to be the pelvic girdle, which is going to have the os coxa that are going to kind of provide this area for the hips. All right, the major function of the appendicular skeleton is going to be kind of allowing us to move from place to place, so locomotion. And it also allows us to manipulate our environment. So think about your hands. So the hands are going to be able to, right now what my hands are doing are they're allowing me to write and manipulate kind of my environment. So bones are going to come in a variety of kind of shapes and sizes. And the different sizes and shapes are going to fulfill particular functions, okay? So for example, the femur, which is kind of the longest bone in the body, is going to be able to withstand great pressure. And let me just point this out just in case you're not familiar with the femur. So the femur are going to be these two long bones right here of the thigh. So they're going to be able to withstand great pressure, and it's hollow. So inside they are hollow. Hollow cylindrical shape. Is going to help provide maximum strength with minimal weight. So if they were kind of fully solid bone, then they would be very heavy, okay? But this allows it to accommodate our upright posture. Upright posture. Okay. Now we're going to talk about kind of different classifications of bones, kind of a new section. These are going to be bone classifications. And so we're going to start putting the different bones into different categories. So the first category are going to be the long bones. Okay, and so the main distinction for long bones is that they are longer than they are wide. So longer than they are wide. Okay, and so for example, we're going to talk about how the three different bones of kind of your phalanges, your fingers, these are considered long bones. They're not large, but they are going to they're longer than they are wide. Okay, so for example, our femur is a long bone, but also most of the our fingers are kind of parts of our feet. All of those are going to be considered long bones. Okay, so in general, they're going to have a shaft, and then they're going to have two endpoints. Okay, and those are usually the ends, two ends, which are slightly expanded. In some cases, even very greatly expanded. Okay, so basically all of the limb bones, except for the wrist and ankle bones, are long bones. Okay, so the wrists or the carpals are not going to be long bones, and the tarsals of the ankles are not going to be long bones, but the rest of it. So, you know, these bones right here, and then you have your metacarpals, the bones of your lower arm and upper arm, of your leg and lower leg, and then the metatarsals and the kind of your toes. All right. They all have this elongated shape, but again, they do not necessarily have to be long in size. Okay, so we're gonna have the hands. So basically these locations right here are the only places in the limbs that do not have long bones. The rest of it are all gonna have long bones, okay? So humerus, we have the radius and the ulna, we have the femur, we have the tibia and fibula, then you have all the toes and the fingers. Those are all going to be considered long bones, okay? The next type of bone is going to be short bones. Okay, so short bones. Okay, so these are roughly a cube shape. Are roughly cube shaped. Okay, and these are mainly going to be the bones of the wrist and the ankles. Okay, now there's a special type of short bone which we call sesamoids. Okay, and this word sort of looks like sesame seed in my mind, and that's actually what it means. So it's the name means shaped like a sesame seed, which is kind of a weird name. But they're a special type of short bone. Okay, that they form in tendon. In tendon. Okay, so for example, sesamoid bone would be a patella, which is your kind of kneecap. Now, interesting thing about these is that they can vary in size and number in different individuals. Okay. And their main function is that they are going to alter the direction of the pull on a tendon, or they kind of reduce friction and modify pressure on tendons to reduce abrasion and tearing. Okay, so they're kind of these helper structures that are going to help reduce some of the friction and abrasion in certain locations. All right, so short bones are going to be found in the ankles and in the wrists. Okay, so those are going to be two of the main locations. Obviously, you can find them in other places, but that is like the patella, but this is going to be the other place where you mainly find them. Okay, flat bones are the next group. And like their name implies, they are thin, flattened, and usually have some curve. Okay, and these bones are going to be the sternum, the scapula, or scapulae for plural, the ribs, and most cranial bones. Okay, so of the skull. Okay, so a flat bone, the sternum is going to be an example of the flat bone right in here. The last main group of bones is going to be this kind of catch-all group that any bone that doesn't really belong in any of the other groups is going to go into this irregular bone group. Okay, so these are going to have just shapes that fit none of the other classes. Okay, so these bones are kind of different. The vertebrae are going to fall into this category, so they are quite different. And the os coxa, which are the hip bones. Okay, so you have the vertebra, which are going to be all in here, and then we're going to have the os coxa, which are the hip bones. So these in this location. Okay, so those are going to be kind of irregular bones. They don't quite fit any of those other categories. All right, so we're now going to start talking about bone structure at the gross level, which is kind of the large level. We'll then talk about the microscopic level, and then eventually we'll get to the chemical level. Okay, so bone structure. All right, so kind of on the large scale, and we call this the gross. This is kind of a weird term. So the gross structure of all bones consists of compact bone sandwiching. So kind of, this is in the middle, spongy bone. Okay, and so we'll kind of define what these two different types are. So this is going to be kind of compact bone. It's very solid looking on the outside of the bone. And then the spongy bone is going to have more holes in it. So think of it like a sponge where it has all these holes. Okay, and so we'll kind of go into more detail about spongy versus compact bone. Now, bones are considered to be organs because they contain multiple different tissue types. So bones are organs. Okay, contain different tissue, different types of tissues. Okay, so bone tissue is going to be the major tissue of this, but there also are going to be other types of tissues. Okay, so we'll say bone or osseous is going to be kind of the dominates bone, but there also is going to be nerve tissue. We're going to have cartilage. Okay, because certain cartilages, specifically articular cartilage, is actually attached to the bone itself. There's going to be dense connective tissue. Okay, so this is going to be kind of covering the external surface. And there also are going to be muscle and epithelial tissues. and the blood vessels. Okay, so these are considered organs because they have all these different types of tissues. All right, so we're now going to go kind of more into the gross anatomy of the bones. Just switch out pins. Okay, so gross anatomy. All right, so we have the two major groups, our type of bone. We have compact and spongy. Okay. The external layer is going to be compact. So on the outside of bone is going to be this compact bone. And spongy is going to be the internal part. So internal to the compact bone is spongy bone. So again, if you look at this image that I printed out, compact bone is going to be on kind of the external surface. Sometimes it's kind of hard to see over on this edge, but it is on that external surface. It's thick right here. And then spongy bone is going to be internal to that. Now a little bit about spongy bone. Compact bone is just very, if you look at it, it looks like it's very tightly compacted. There's not a lot of spaces. Spongy bone obviously has spongy look. Okay. Spongy is also sometimes called trabecular bone. Okay, and this word trabecular means little beams. Okay. So if you look inside spongy bone, it has this kind of honeycomb look. Honeycomb of small needle-like flat pieces called trabeculae. Okay. So I'm actually going to show you, this is a flat bone. We'll look back at this in a second, but I feel like you can really see the trabeculae very good in this picture. And so you can just, they are flattened and they have honeycomb appearance. These are the actual trabeculae. Okay, so the gaps in between are just open spaces, but the actual bone tissue of the spongy bone is called trabeculae. Okay, the trabeculae is actually quite strong and is going to be able to help provide strength. But it also is going to be kind of filled with red or yellow bone marrow, okay? So spaces between trabeculae are filled with red or yellow bone marrow. Okay. So we're now going to talk kind of specifically about the different classifications of bone and how they're structured with the compact and spongy bone, because it's going to kind of depend on what we're looking at. So the first, we'll look at structure of the short, irregular, and flat bones. Okay, they all have the similar pattern of thin plates of spongy bone covered with these compact bone. Okay, so thin plates of spongy bone covered with compact bone. Okay. The compact bone is covered outside and inside by two membranes. Okay, so compact bone covered externally and internally by membranes. Okay, and we're gonna now talk about what these membranes are called. Okay, so membranes. Okay, and we've mentioned these ones before, but we have outside, which is gonna be the periosteum. Forgot my eye, periosteum. And the inside is endosteum. Okay, so peri, outside, endo, inside, osteum for the other part of the word. Okay, so let's see. Did I skip a page? Yeah. All right. So we are going to sometimes see these kind of short, irregular, flat bones. They will form movable joints. And if they do have movable joints, they're going to have kind of hyaline cartilage on their surface. Okay, so for some of these, they will have that. Okay, so just a little bit show you. So this is actually part of the one of the cranial bones. So you have a thin layer of compact bone on both sides, and then you're going to have the spongy bone on the center part. And then when we come inside, we're going to start looking at this. We will start talking about the actual membranes that are important for these. The endosteum or endosteum is going to be kind of within all of these surrounding the trabeculae. It basically covers all of the surfaces. So if it's internal, it's going to be the endosteum. And if it's on the outside, it's going to be the periosteum. All right, so now we're going to move on to long bones. So kind of what is the typical structure of typical long bone? Okay, so these are going to be quite different looking on inside. Okay, and so basically with a few exceptions, so there are a couple long bones that do not fit into this category, but all of them are going to have a shaft, okay, which is going to be kind of like the long portion of the actual, so if we're going to draw it out, it'd be the kind of long portion, and then at the end you're going to have, and obviously this is not a real bone shape, but they're going to be bone ends. Okay, so bone ends. Okay, they're also are going to have membranes on the outside, so we'll talk about the membranes for these ones. Okay, with the long bones, we're going to have more terminology for the particular parts of the long bone. Okay, and so one of these terms is going to be called the diaphysis. Okay, and just to give you what this means, so dia means through, and physis means growth. Okay, and again, for some reason I like to know what these mean because then it kind of triggers in my head what's happening. Okay, so the diaphysis is basically going to be this part right here, which is going to be the long part of the bone. Okay, so it's going to form the long axis of bone. It is going to have a thick collar of compact bone. So it's going to be kind of, the outside is going to have a thick layer of compact bone. All right, and it is going to surround a central cavity, which we are going to call the medullary cavity. Okay, surrounds a central medullary cavity. Okay, another term for this is going to be a marrow cavity. So this is where the bone marrow, this is going to be kind of in the center of the bone. So bone marrow. Okay, and in that location, there is no bone tissue. Okay, so surrounds the central medullary cavity, no bone tissue. Okay, so it's not really going to have any actual spongy bone in that location really, or in the inside, it's not going to have any compact bone. So it's actually empty. Okay, now it can either be full of, so the medullary cavity can have either yellow marrow or red marrow. All right, and actually, it's usually only going to have, for most of these, it's only going to have yellow actually in the long bones. Sorry, I forgot. I was, in this kind, normally they're just going to have yellow marrow in these. In adults, it does have red when it's babies, so infants have it, but I'll leave that off of this. I don't want to confuse you because as adults, we only have yellow bone marrow, which is basically fat. Okay. So I just want to show you, this is, so this is going to be one of our bones, and specifically the humerus. It is going to have kind of this compact bone on the outside. The diaphysis is going to be the central location. Compact bone, medullary cavity. The medullary cavity is going to be lined with endosteum, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and we'll look more in this location over here. But we're mainly talking about this location right here, okay? And we'll start talking about spongy bone and things like that. In adulthood, this will be lined with yellow marrow. All right. All right. The next major structure we're going to talk about are the ends, basically. So these are the epiphysis, or we can call this plural is epiphyses. So these are going to be the bone ends. So the kind of the two different ends of these bones. The word epi means upon. Okay, so it's going to be the top and the bottom. And in these locations, there is going to be an outer shell of compact bone. Okay, which is going to be the exterior, and then inside is going to be spongy bone. Oops, bone. On the external surface, outside of the compact bone, is going to be a thin layer of articular hyaline. Cartilage. Okay, because these are going to interact with other bones. So it's going to cover the joint surface. All right, so we have depending on the bone, the epiphysis that's closest to kind of the trunk of the body is going to be the proximal epiphysis, and then the other side will be the distal epiphysis. You have this articular cartilage, you're going to have a layer of the compact bone, and then in here you're going to have spongy bone. Okay, and in the humerus and in the femur, this is going to be a location of red bone marrow. Which not all long bones are going to have that, but some of them will actually have some in that spongy bone area. Okay, so we have this interesting kind of line in between where we have the epiphysis and we have the diaphysis. And so we're going to talk about this structure right here. Okay, and so we have between the diaphysis and each epiphysis of an adult, long bone is an epiphyseal line, which is where the epiphyseal plate was located. So where epiphyseal plate was. Okay, and so then we need to talk about what is the epiphyseal plate. This is basically the growth plate. So when we're growing, this is the site of location, the location of the actual growth. Okay, so this is called the growth plate. Okay, and it is going to be a disc of hyaline cartilage that grows during childhood. Okay, and it helps to lengthen the bone. All right. So that would be this location right here. So we have the epiphyseal line. If it's called the epiphyseal line, then it's going to be what it looks like in adult. It'll be an actual plate that is growing, and it'll be the actual cartilage during kind of childhood. Okay. In this location, kind of where we have the flared portion, where the diaphysis and epiphysis meet, we are sometimes give this name of the metaphysis. So it'd be kind of right here. This is not actually labeled on this bone, and I don't think we normally talk about the metaphysis. But again, it's going to be kind of where you have this flare point from the shaft to the epiphysis. All right, so let's start talking about some of the membranes. Okay. So there are quite a few membranes that are going to be important. All right, so we've talked about the periosteum. And so this is going to be a glistening, this is how the book describes it, glistening white double layered membrane. Okay. The word peri, or the prefix peri, means around, and osteo means bone. So this is gonna be a round bone. Okay, so what the periosteum is going to do is it's going to cover the entire external surface except for the joint surfaces. So cover the external surface of the entire bone except the joint surfaces. Okay, which are going to have that articular cartilage. There are two layers, so this is a double layered membrane. So the two layers, so we're gonna have an outer fibrous layer, which is made out of dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay, and then the inner layer is going to be what we call the osteogenic layer. Okay, and so this is actually next to the surface of the bone. Oops. All right, and in this location, we're going to have what we call osteoprogenitor cells. osteoprogenitor, which basically means cells that are going to give rise to other bone cells. Okay, so osteoprogenitor cells are stem cells. Stem cells that give rise to most bone cells. Okay, so for example, osteoclasts and osteoblasts will be here. Okay, so these are bone destroying cells. And these are bone forming cells. All right. The periosteum is going to have lots of nerve fibers. So periosteum. So blood vessels and nerve fibers, okay, that are going to be able to supply the this area with some more blood. Because there's lots of nerve fibers, when you break a bone, you will have a lot of blood and you also have a lot of pain. So the periosteum is going to be kind of part of that. Now, another kind of part of this, so actually let me just show this really fast. So we have, this is going to be spongy bone. We have compact bone right here. We're going to have endosteum, which is going to surround all of these. The articular cartilage is going to be on this outside. And then if we look at kind of this bone structure, we have the periosteum. So this is the periosteum fibrous layer. And then we're going to have kind of the osteoprogenitor cells are going to be on the inner layer and the dense connective tissue on the outside layer. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the other things that are happening in this area. So there's something called perforating fibers that are going to be kind of involved with the periosteum. So we have perforating fibers. Okay, so these are going to be bundles of collagen fibers that extend into the bone matrix. Okay, and what they do is they secure the periosteum to the underlying bone. Okay, and then another function of the periosteum itself is going to provide kind of anchoring points for tendons and ligaments. All right. Okay, so that is the periosteum. So that's going to be on the outside. All right, and then we have perforating fibers. You can see them kind of right here. Those are going to be what actually connects it. I feel like if you've ever eaten chicken wings or chicken off a bone, you run into this kind of membrane at some point. Usually it's broken down quite a bit because it's been cooked, but you know, this will be kind of surrounding the bone. All right, so on the inside of the bone, we have the endosteum. Okay, which means within bone. Okay, and so this is going to be a delicate connective tissue membrane. And it covers internal bone surfaces. Okay, so this is going to be in all of these holes. We're going to talk about the central canals. We're going to have the Volkswagen canals. All of those are going to be lined with endosteum. Okay. It is going to cover the trabeculae of the spongy bone, lines the canals. Okay, so let me just write this. So covers trabeculae, okay, canals that pass through the compact bone. Okay, and it's going to have similar cells as the periosteum and that inner layer. So it's going to have osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Okay. All right. A little bit about the blood supply and the nerves of this area. Okay, so lots and lots, there's a high blood supply to this area. So blood vessels and nerves. Okay, the main thing is just know that it's well vascularized. So lots of blood is going to be in these areas. There are main vessels that go to the diaphysis. And for example, these ones are going to be called nutrients, kind of nutrient supply arteries, and there's going to be nutrient veins, but they're going to be the main ones that are going to be entering kind of the diaphysis area. And there are also going to be areas on the epiphysis that will also have these big veins, but the main thing is that they're going to kind of go into these rather larger openings called the nutrient foramen, which the word foramen means opening or hole. And so you're going to have large blood supplies going into the actual bones. Okay, so sometimes they're called nutrient arteries or nutrient veins. So you can write that, nutrient artery or vein. Okay, and they enter the diaphysis through something called the nutrient foramen. Okay, and then there's going to be epiphyseal arteries and veins as well. Okay, a little bit about the blood producing cells, or blood producing tissues. So we have the hematopoietic tissue of bones. Okay, so this is going to be the red bone marrow. And it's going to be found in different locations in adults and infants. Okay, so in infants, you are going to find basically red marrow in all the medullary cavities. Okay, of the diaphysis. Okay, and anywhere you have spongy bone. In adults, this changes. Okay, so the medullary cavities in general are filled with yellow marrow. Okay, so red marrow is only going to be found in cavities of trabeculae of spongy bones. Okay, and most of it is going to be found in long bones. Or sorry, most of the marrow that's found in long bones in babies will be replaced by yellow marrow. So let me just first write that. So most red marrow in long bones replaced by yellow marrow. Okay, and so then most of the red marrow is going to be found in cavities between trabeculae spongy bone. Okay, and mainly going to be found in flat bones, like the skull, sternum, ribs, clavicle, scapula, hip bones, and vertebra. I kind of ran out of space, so let me just write that on here. So these are going to be bones with bone marrow, red bone marrow. Okay, so we have skull, sternum, ribs, clavicle, scapulae, hip bones, okay, and the vertebra. And then you find it in the heads of the femur and humerus. So those are the big, kind of the biggest bones of the upper and lower body. The red marrow of flat bones is more active in producing, so these ones are more active in producing blood cells, okay? And another little side note, the yellow marrow of other bones can convert to red bone marrow if an individual is extremely anemic. So yellow marrow can convert back to red if person is anemic. Okay, so that means that that person needs, doesn't have enough red blood cells, and so in that situation, they can start to convert yellow bone marrow back into red until that's going to be back. Okay, and so here we have some of the yellow bone marrow in the compact bone. I don't have a picture of any of the red bone marrow. All right, so this next little section is going to start telling us how to talk about some of the bone structures that we have on the outsides of bones. So these are called bone markings, and these are going to become your nemesi in the next lab unit, okay? So these are gonna be all those little weird shapes on the outsides of bones that are basically where muscles and the ligaments are going to attach. Okay, so bone markings are kind of how bones attach to muscles and ligaments. Okay, there are 3 categories, and you will come into contact with all of these. The first category are projections. Okay, and these are going to be sites of muscle and ligament attachment. Okay, we're going to have surfaces, which are going to be areas that form joints. Okay, and then the last major group are going to be depressions and openings. Okay, and these are going to be places for blood vessels. And nerves. okay? So what I'm going to show you right now, and you're going to want to become familiar with these, they're going to keep on kind of showing up over and over again, are different types of bone marking terminologies. And so these are different types of projections that you have on different bones. You're going to hear the word turbosity quite often, crest, trochanter, line, tubercle, epicondyle, spine, and process. All of these are going to be different terms that you'll then hear about on the actual bones you'll learn. So on the femur, for example, you have trochanter, you have this intertrochanteric line, you're going to have a condyle, epicondyle, you're going to have ischial spine, ischial turbosity, spinous process. All of these are going to be places where you have actual muscle and ligament attachment, okay? So you're going to want to go through these and kind of learn the different terms. This is going to be on the PowerPoints. The next one are going to be surfaces that help form joints. And so you're going to hear the word head, facet, and condyle. You're going to notice that condyle is something I guess that wasn't on the other list. But these are going to be places where you have kind of articulation with another bone. So we have a condyle on the mandible, which is where it's going to actually attach to the other part of the skull. You're going to have the head on the ribs. So this is going to be where it's going to articulate with the vertebra and things like that. The last group are going to be depressions and openings. So there's lots of different terms for these. We have groove, fissure, foramen. Foramen's a big one. Notch. There's medius, sinus, and fossa. So again, you're going to want to become familiar with these names because you're going to hear them a lot. So we have the external auditory medius. This is actually the internal auditory medius of the temporal bone, but you'll have different foramens, which are going to be holes where cranial nerves are going to actually go through. So take some time and learn those and become familiar with what these things mean, because then they'll tell you a little bit about what that bone is going to be either connected to or what its function is. All right, so that is kind of the gross anatomy of bones. And now we're going to move on to kind of the microscopic anatomy. This is mainly going to be a review because we've already talked about this quite a bit. Okay, so there are 5 major types of bone cells. Okay, and they're going to be the osteogenic, or you can call it, which I've called it before, osteoprogenitor cells. Okay, so these are going to be kind of create the cells. We're going to have the osteoblasts, osteocytes. We're going to have these things we have not talked about, bone lining cells, and osteoclasts. These first 4, all of those are going to originate from embryonic connective tissue cells. Osteoclasts are actually derived from white blood cells. So they're going to be related to kind of macrophages. Okay, so the osteogenic cells, okay, also the osteoprogenitor cells. These are going to be mitotically active stem cells. Okay, they are going to be found in the 2 membranes, the periosteum and the endosteum. Okay, they are going to be kind of the cells that will turn into ultimately osteoblasts. Okay, our next group is going to be the osteoblasts, which this is definitely review because we've talked about these. So these are bone forming cells. Okay, they secrete matrix. Okay, and they're also going to secrete different types of proteins. So they produce the unmineralized bone matrix. Okay, they are active mitotically. Okay, and then they're going to secrete collagen and calcium binding proteins. Okay, this is all going to be called osteoid. Again, this is the kind of prior to being filled with inorganic salts. Osteoblasts will also be important in kind of matrix calcification, but we will talk about that when we talk about the development of bone. Okay, let's see. When a osteoblast becomes completely surrounded by matrix, it turns into an osteocyte, which is our next group. I forgot, I have kind of pictures of what these ones. So this is the osteoprogenitor cell. Stem cell, it's kind of got this squamous shape. It may become an osteoblast, and if it does, it has more of a cuboidal shape. This is going to be, again, important for bone growth, making the different matrix parts. And then if we go to the next one, the osteocyte. Osteocytes tend to be kind of spider-shaped where they have these projections that are coming off the sides. So these are going to be the mature bone cells, and they will be found within the lacunae. Okay, so these are mature, found in lacunae. Okay, they monitor and maintain bone matrix. And they do this interesting thing where they kind of act as stress and strain sensors. Okay, and respond to mechanical stress or mechanical stimuli. Okay, basically they are able to tell if there's bone loading, so kind of weight bearing, bone deformation, and also weightlessness. So if you have someone that goes into space, their bones actually start to change internally because they're not having the same types of bone loading and deformation that's normal with gravity. And so the bones will actually start to alter themselves, okay? They will communicate. So the osteocytes kind of will sense this and then communicate with osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Okay, to kind of have bone remodeling happen. Okay, so if bone needs to be made or degraded, it basically can communicate that to the cells that can actually do that. So it doesn't do it itself. Okay, and then also it can help trigger modeling, bone remodeling, so that if calcium needs to be released or absorbed as well. All right, osteoclasts are this next group. Oops, sorry, I forgot bone lining cells. Let me just skip osteoclasts for a second. Bone lining cells. So these are going to be, so they are flat cells found on bone surfaces where bone remodeling is not going on. We won't really talk about them much. not one, on. Okay, now we're gonna go on to osteoclasts. Okay, and we'll talk more about how osteoclasts actually do all of this. But for today, we'll just kind of mention the main functions. Okay, so these cells are going to be a lot larger, and they are multi-nucleated, which means that they have multiple nuclei. They are going to be at sites of reabsorption, and you're going to notice that they have these really wavy, kind of fringed edge to them. This increases the surface area, so more enzymatic materials can be released and help kind of degrade the bone, basically. So that's going to help them kind of do that. This is a weird group because they're actually derived from white blood cell lineage. So they are different from the other groups, which are going to be coming from this bone cell lineage that ultimately comes from kind of this embryonic connective tissue. Okay, so giant multi-nucleated, okay? They are going to degrade, destroy bone in the remodeling process. So if you break something, you have to actually get rid of it. They're going to be derived from white blood cells, okay? And they're actually going to be very similar to macrophages. They are not macrophages, but they are similar to them, okay? And this is actually a picture of kind of the bone. We have bone matrix right here. This is the lacunae. Inside of it's the osteocyte. This is an actual osteoclast, and you can see the fringed border. And so this is going to help degrade whatever bone tissue right here, whatever's wrong with it. Okay. Let's see. The next area, so on top of the actual cells, we're now going to talk about kind of the actual microscopic anatomy of compact bone. Okay, and compact bone, on appearance, it looks like it's very solid, but there actually is lots of passageways within it. Okay, so it's riddled with passageways that serve as conduits, so kind of locations for nerves and blood vessels to go through. Okay, the kind of structural unit of a compact bone is going to be the osteon. Okay, so this is the structural unit of compact bone. Each osteon is an elongated cylinder, okay? And it is going to go in kind of, it's oriented parallel to the long axis of bone. So what that means is that if you have a long bone like this, you know, the osteons are going to run this direction, okay, from the long axis. They do not run this direction. All right. You can think of osteons as these like tiny weight-bearing pillars. Pillars are very strong. You find them in architecture a lot. And so this is going to allow for a lot of strength. So this is what this is going to kind of look like in the actual bone. So we have, this is actually showing collagen fibers, and we're going to talk about more about this in a sense. But these are the osteons, so these cylinders. that are going to kind of run parallel to the length of the bone. Okay, each matrix tube is going to then have kind of the surrounding, so kind of they have the circular shape. And I've drawn this previous to this, so it kind of looks like this, where if you're looking down at it, you have these concentric circles. Okay, and so each tube we call lamellae. Oops, I spelled that wrong. That's an E, lamellae, which means little plate. Okay, and in each of the lamellae, you're going to have collagen fibers that are running. Okay, and so this is kind of what this picture shows. You see these collagen fibers, and the collagen fibers all run in the same direction on a lamellae, but then if you go from one lamellae to another one, they go in opposite directions. This makes bone very strong, and it has it's kind of able to withstand twisting. Okay, so let me just write that out. So each tube lamellae, so all collagen fibers in a particular, man, my spelling is not, particular lamellae run in a single direction. Okay, and then the kind of in the layers around that lamellae, the other lamellae are going to have the fibers running in different directions, which allows for resistance to kind of twisting. Okay, so again, lamellae, 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 layers of lamellae. Okay, the osteon is going to be kind of this whole structure. The fibers in the lamellae are running in different directions. Okay, if you print this out or see it on your computer, you're going to see that. This is important. It allows for this to have a really high resistance to twisting. Okay, the actual inorganic salts that are going to also be kind of deposited within the fiber or between the fibers are also going to line up in different directions, so that you don't want everything kind of lined up the same way, because that's going to not be as strong. Okay, and here is another kind of picture of this. So here is going to be an osteon right here. You have the lamellae. Here's a lamellae, lamellae, lamellae. And now we're going to talk about kind of how the different cells are located in there and these different canals. Okay, so one thing that we have are canals and what we call caniculi, which are like little canals. Okay, so running through the core of each osteon. Okay, so again, this would be the whole osteon. Running through the center, so this very central part is going to be a central canal. So we're going to have central canal. I want to remind you that this is also called a Haversian canal. That is the name of some individual that must have also discovered these. What runs in these are going to be the blood vessels and nerves. And I want to just remind you that central canal, any canal within the bone is going to be lined with that osteum. Okay, so that kind of inner membrane of that membrane of there. Okay, so you have central canals, and then you're going to have kind of a different set of canals that are going to run in the opposite direction. So central canals are going to run down the length of the bones, and then we're going to have these other ones which we call perforating canals, which are going to run perpendicular to that. Okay, and so we have running perpendicular, so at a right angle. We have what we call perforating. These are also called Volkmann's canals, okay? So these are going to connect in the opposite direction, and they mainly are going to help connect the blood and nerve supply of the medullary cavity to the central canal. Okay, so medullary cavity, which is the very center, to central canal. Okay, so that's going to be that connection. All right. Okay, all the canals are lined with endosteum. And then in between, we're going to have kind of the cells are located in here. These are going to be the osteocytes that are going to be located kind of in between. And there are these little projections. They kind of look like spiders. Those are going to kind of form something called caniculi. Okay, so let me just write that out for you. Okay, so osteocytes occupy lacunae. Okay, and there are going to be hair-like canals called caniculi. Caniculi. Okay, that radiate from lacunae, connecting them to each other and to central canal. All right, so the lacunae, are going to be these structures right here where the cells are, and then you can see these little caniculi that go in between. All right, so there are going to be different types of lamellae. So we have the lamellae around the actual osteons, but we're also going to have something called circumferential lamellae. So I want to kind of just mention these other types of lamellae. Okay, so the first type is called interstitial. Okay, and so this is going to kind of fill in any areas in between the osteon. So we have like an osteon right here, but then there are other areas that are not going to be in the circular, and they're kind of where other osteons have either run into each other or have been remodeled. And so anything that's kind of in a gap in between and outside of an osteon is going to be called interstitial lamellae. So lying in between intact osteons are incomplete lamellae called interstitial, kind of in between lamellae. Okay, so they fill gaps. The second type that's kind of a different one is called circumferential. So like the circumference. And these are going to be located deep to the periosteum. But just superior to the endosteum. And so, let me just write, superficial to the, okay, and they extend around entire circumference of the diaphysis. So you can kind of think of this as, you know, you have we're looking at like a cross section of the bone. We'll have the medullary cavity in here. And then we have kind of these osteons that have been growing. And so in there, you'll have like the different layers, the lamellae. In between them, like in these little gaps, will be that interstitial. And then on the outside, there will be this continuous circumferential lamina, which is going to be around the entire circle, okay? So it is going to be around, and this is just in the diaphysis region. So you have this circumferential lamellae, okay? That's going to be sitting around there. The rest of these are going to have like central canals, all that kind of good stuff. But this is just going to be kind of a different set around. And it's going to be a couple layers thick. It's not just one layer thick. If you look at this closely, you can kind of see how this whole region right here is going to be the circumferential lamellae. Okay? All right. Just a little bit about the microscopic anatomy of spongy bone, just quickly. Okay, and so the trabeculae, while they look sort of random, they are not. They all align precisely along lines of stress. Okay, and so the actual spongy bone will align the way that the bone is going to impact stress, and so that it'll be the strongest direction. Okay, so it appears that they are not kind of going in any particular direction, but they actually are precisely aligned. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about is going to be the chemical composition of bone. And for this, you're going to have both organic and inorganic substances, okay, which gives the bone something that's very strong and yet durable. The organic is going to be kind of soft. Organic component is going to be this bone cells and osteoid, which is the matrix, okay? It is going to be really good at resisting tension and stretch. The hard organic part is going to be mineral salts, mainly calcium and phosphate. Okay, and those are going to be really good at kind of resisting tension. All right. And so healthy bone is about half as strong as steel is resisting to compression, and it's fully as strong as steel in resisting tension. So bone is very, very strong. Okay. A little bit more about the mineral salts, this inorganic components. So this makes up about 56% of the weight of bone. And the actual calcium salts are going to be tiny, tightly packed needle-like crystals. Okay, and they give kind of this exceptional hardness. Okay, and this stuff right here, this mineral salt, lasts long after death. And so when you find bones of ancient people or organisms, you are finding the inorganic part. Okay, so that is what we're gonna leave off with for this lecture, and then we'll start going into kind of more information about the skeleton next time. Thank you.